Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to the Conduit Club. Um, and maybe I just start by saying I've been thinking about this question, the future of capitalism, for a long time. And I don't really know why, but when I was kind of tired with capital markets at Morgan, I convinced them to let me move into the private equity venture capital area. And, um, and I decided to focus on the education industry and the alternative energy industry. So I was thinking about aligning capital with social purpose and made my first, what we now call impact investment, $22 million into a charter school company in 1997. And we had the exact same conversation about whether you can align, whether you can do well by doing good and blah, blah, blah in 1997 with the investment committee at JPMorgan that we're having over at, um, what's it called? Change Now this week. And so I've gotten a little tired of that conversation, but that sent me on a path to kind of basically on a search, which has become my life purpose. And I left JP Morgan in 2001 after the merger with Chase. I experienced 9/11 up close and personal, and that caused me to start reading books that bankers don't read. And one of them was Limits to Growth. Anyone familiar with? Great. This is an inside crowd. Usually when you ask that question, you maybe get one or two hands. And that book shook me to the core because as a financier, I understood that the what I now call the finance algorithm not only preferred growth, liked growth, but necessitated growth. And it locked the system into growth. And we can debate what we mean by growth, but at a macro level, we were in lock-in, and it was because people like me, I was a derivatives guy at the beginning. It's people like me who think they're so smart, who are actually, dialing in and locking in the algorithm. And in a sense, it was useful because it allowed us to make money, but it was beyond greed. It was actually a worldview, an ideology that we were trapping the world in. And it's the ultimate example of the tail wagging the dog. And derivatives markets were extremely abstract and disconnected from, we were just joking, what we call the real economy. But it didn't matter because it worked. So I got tired of the capital markets business, and as I said, and moved into the venture capital private equity area. But that too, so I was dabbling in impact investing, but it was reading Limits to Growth that really, really shook me. And so that led me to discover there was a discipline called ecological economics. And we're going to hear from one of the original thinkers in that field in a moment. But ecological economics provided me a framework to think about this exponential growth on a finite planet problem in a very rigorous way. And I have a huge debt to Herman Daly, Tim Jackson, and about a half a dozen other thinkers who've been at it, honestly, since the 1970s, when Limits to Growth was written. Kenneth Boulding was an economist who said anyone who believes in infinite growth on a finite world is either a madman or an economist. So this is not a new thing. And of course, it's now becoming popularized, finally, with concepts like post-growth and degrowth. But this is a half a century old, this understanding. And while there's been many advances in this, I came away thinking that if the only answer out of this bind we've created for ourselves and locked in with the finance algorithm is essentially we need to massively shrink in the developed world and then learn how to share better and allow the quote unquote undeveloped world to grow, I just couldn't see how we were going to make it. And I got depressed. And then I had an interesting experience in my impact investment kind of part of my life. I met a man named Alan Savory. And Alan Savory had he's now 90. So over the course of his life, he had perfected an idea of holistic planned grazing. So he's known as the grazing guy, but really what he was perfecting is this idea of holistic decision making. And then I learned and discovered that Western modernity is built on reductionist logic from Descartes and Newton. And by the way, neoclassical economics is built directly on the chassis of Newtonian. Looks like someone's done their homework. It's literally lifted Newtonian physics equations and assumed they apply to the economy. And I had this, and by the way, finance lifts Newton's understanding of time, the reversibility of time. But it turns out time is path dependent. So all of our foundational theories of finance are built on a flawed assumption. So we've got neoclassical economics that ignored the second law of thermodynamics, and finance, which is built on the assumption that you can move cash flows around in time, and what happens today doesn't affect what's going to happen tomorrow, when of course we all know, just common sense, that what happens today will change the possibilities of what we do tomorrow. So I was like, this whole thing is wrong. And there's a whole bunch of smart people, but no one's talking about this. How is that possible? And that's a whole question for another day. I don't have an answer to that, but it's incredible how we're locked in this paradigm, and yet it's sort of demonstrably scientifically incorrect, limited at best, limited accuracy at best, and incorrect for the most part. And this isn't a critique of people. Like, this doesn't mean bankers are bad people. This is way bigger than that. This is like, we've gone down this path as modern Western society and chosen to believe in a story that is at best partially true and misses things that are profoundly important. So going back to the Alan Savory story, so he developed this methodology of holistically managing grasslands. And I had this insight that grasslands are a living system. What if we thought of the economy as a living system? Is it a living system? And if it's a living system, can we apply this same holistic thinking to manage the economy? Well, it turns out I have three simple premises. The human economy is a living system made up of living systems called human beings. We can debate whether the human economy is a living system, but we can't debate whether human beings are living systems. And in the fractal nature of living systems, I would suggest that anything made up of groups of humans and their technologies and tools are also living systems as opposed to machines. But the logic of economics was built on the logic of the reductionist logic of the machine. And so if the human economy is a living system, then we can learn how living systems work. And there's some patterns and principles that describe how life does life. This is known as the regenerative process. This is science. And then the third premise is, if the human economy is to continue as a living system, not a collapsed system, either it has to follow these same patterns and principles that describe all other living systems. And I'm not even talking about on planet Earth, I'm talking about across the universe, I've learned from cosmologists like Jude Currivan. Then we're going to need to align our human economy with these same patterns and principles. Or some smart banker is going to need to tell me why the human economy is the only exception to the rule, that living systems follow these same patterns and principles. And so that's the gist of this idea. And how we implement that is a whole other conversation, which maybe we can get to. But at the core, this is, we need to think of the economy as a living organism and learn how to create conditions for living systems to thrive. Janine Benyus says life creates the conditions for life. And if we do that, we will unlock the trap we've created for ourselves and manifest potential that none of us can see. And this is profoundly hopeful because, and I've seen it in the real world. I've seen it on the grasslands. I've seen it in agriculture. I've seen it in technology. This isn't an agriculture idea alone, although it's certainly rooted in agriculture. And so for me, the double bind of exponential growth on a finite planet, we have to grow or we collapse, but if we grow, we collapse. There needs to be an escape valve. And the escape valve, I would submit, and the idea of this book, is potential that we can't see in advance, which makes it very scary for us who have been trained in reductionist mechanistic thinking with our metrics and our goals that we can meet or not meet. But we've had goals and new goals and better metrics, and it's not working. So I would suggest that we can continue using our goals and develop measures for sure, but recognize that we should be using those to assess what we've missed as opposed to think we know the answer. And if we align with the patterns and principles that explain how life works, we will surprise ourselves and we will discover that our prosperity, our well-being, our happiness is likely to come from places that are not in our models and they're not in our spreadsheets. Turns out that in the Sanskrit, this is also a need to draw on our more feminine ways of knowing, intuitive ways of knowing. It's a need to reconnect with more Eastern and indigenous ways of knowing as opposed to purely Western ways of knowing. And it turns out I learned just recently, actually this is in David Bohm's book, in the Sanskrit, Eastern thinking, the word measure and metric means what we think it does, but it has a second meaning. It means illusion. And so whatever measures and metrics we use, chances are not the truth. And that we need to look for where the, GDP, we've been building the economy on GDP. Well, it turns out that was an illusion. So at any rate, I forgot to tell my opening story, and then I'll end. After I read Limits to Growth, I had an opportunity to work with Dennis Meadows, one of the authors of Limits to Growth, and I dedicated the book to Dana Meadows, who wrote the book Limits to Growth, lead author. And I had an opportunity to learn about system science from Dennis Meadows. Pretty cool. And we did this whole thing. There was probably a dozen of us in a workshop, and when we got done, he took questions. And the first question was, this lady said, so Dennis, and this was back in 2004. And so, and we'd gone through the, exponential growth collapse is essentially the base case scenario. And back in 2004, no one was talking about collapse. No one was talking about degrowth or anything like that. And so she asked, so Dennis, how will we know when collapse is near? And he said, oh, that's easy. The first thing to go will be our ability to cope. So I think this is a very profound moment because we're collectively and individually losing our ability to cope. And I can't imagine how difficult it is for my kids who've known nothing other than the chaos that we're living in. I should have started out by saying I apologize as an American, but maybe the universe, Jude, the cosmologists tell us the universe is intelligent. Maybe the universe is actually delivering this rupture for a reason, because we were not going to change course without the rupture. So yes, this is chaos. Yes, this is crazy. Yes, this is terrifying. But in living systems, there's something called the adaptive cycle, where systems kind of grow exponentially, slow down, begin to degrade, collapse, and then reorganize and do it again, and collapse and redo it again, like a forest fire. And so I happen to think we're living through the collapse and do it again. And I don't know whether that lasts 10 years or a century. None of us knows. It's possible that it lasts a century. I don't think it will. I think it's measured in decades, but I'm just guessing. And so What that means is we can either sit back and watch it happen and freak out, or we can follow the latest science, which 2022 Nobel in Physics, universal entanglement, tells us that what we do, what we even think, what we set our intention to, will affect the outcome because everything's connected to everything in relationship. So it's actually very empowering. And it doesn't mean that any of us will, quote, fix the problem, but we will influence the pathway. And that to me is a reason to A, remain hopeful, and B, remain engaged, and C, have a story to tell my children. So with that, I would like to bring two of my friends up to join us, along with Katie. Maybe I'd just do a quick introduction. Louise Kjellerup Roper is the CEO of Volans, a consultancy that's been at the leading edge of the sustainability conversation for 18th birthday, 18-year-old birthday today. Many of you have heard of John Elkington, and he is in many ways the father of the sustainability movement. I can assure you that Louise is the, how do I say this without saying something, the wise mother of the shift and transition to recognizing that the sustainability pathway of fixing our problems is not working, and we need to move into a more regenerative paradigm. So thank you for coming, Louise. Louise. And then Tim Jackson's here. And, when I first wandered in to the circle of ecological economists, Tim Jackson, Peter Victor, Herman Daly, the father of ecological economics, they all put up with this banker who was asking stupid questions because the financial crisis had just happened. And so they were curious to learn from me as much as I was curious to learn from them. And, Tim is the, one of the OGs here of this idea that has now become popularized, at least in Europe. Unfortunately, it's not in the US. But the deep thinking that happened around understanding how the entropy law affects our economy was done by people like Tim. And in 2009, he wrote a book called Prosperity Without Growth in response to the UK government's search for how to deal with this, 2009. And yet, what's happened since then? So, maybe one message is we've been trying a lot of stuff, and there's almost like new generations coming along, and we're going to repeat the same stuff we've been trying. We need to move through that and beyond that, which isn't to say it's not correct, but in my opinion, there has to be more to it. And so, Tim, thank you for coming. I haven't seen you in years, but it's an honor for you to have joined us here. So let's have a conversation.
You can't leave. All come to hear you.
So I think I'm going to kick this conversation off. Maybe I'd start really just picking up, Tim, if you would, on the last point I made. I'm just curious, as an original thinker around this idea of growth and how we manage an economy where growth is no longer an endless horizon. It's a long time since 2009 when you first wrote that and you were engaged with the government at the highest level here in the UK. Share with us your perspective on what's happened since then.
Yeah. First of all, thank you, John, for asking me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think the last time we sat together for any length of time was not long after 2009, actually, when you'd sort of begun your journey. And I remember that conversation like it was yesterday, and the kind of enthusiasm for it that you had, which was great. It was really infectious. And so it's wonderful to be here to celebrate regenerative economics. I just wanted to ask you, what does OG stand for?
The original.
Ah, okay,
It's good.
okay, good.
It's a compliment.
Yeah. I was
How
thinking
about the goat?
own goal, own goal.
I know.
If you want a career as an economist, don't start questioning growth.
You're right.
So that was back in 2009, as you said. What has happened since then? I mean, I guess the writing was on the wall right from the beginning, because I have to say that although the work was originally commissioned by the UK government, they weren't that pleased to receive it. In fact, that's a bit of an underestimate. And some of my close friends have said to me, "That was your downfall, Tim. That was the point you threw your career away." Actually, I kind of think like it sort of made my career, but it made it in a very specific sense, which was I was forever the guy that wrote Prosperity Without Growth, and I now had to be the defender of degrowth and post-growth and the anti-growth position and maybe anti-capitalism, but I should do that with some restraint, because attacking growth is just about okay, but attacking capitalism, my goodness, there's no ear for you in today's society if that's what you're going to do. That kind of stuff we don't hold much credit to. And so you ask me almost an impossible question to answer, which is, how do I reflect on all that after 17 years since Prosperity Without Growth was published? I mean, the one thing I can say is that conversation that was, I can't even say it was sparked by Prosperity Without Growth, because you say limits to growth had sparked a much bigger conversation 30 something years before. But
1972.
1972, exactly. And Dennis Meadows, we were talking just before the meeting, actually, Dennis Meadows, who's one of the authors of that report, has been going at it even longer than I have by any stretch of the imagination. And it's a tough kind of fight, because the language, the motivation, the political mantra is still growth, growth, growth. In this country, we had almost successive governments. One, the very short-lived Liz Truss government, and then this government that we have at the moment, the Starmer government. Both of them opened conference speeches with "Our party has only three things to say: growth, growth, and growth." It was like Keir Starmer is channeling Liz Truss. That is absolutely bizarre. They're at opposite ends of the political spectrum, and one had the shortest period of government I think, in British history, and the other is looking for a 2-3 term government. You'd be lucky if he gets it, but that's not the point. The point is that for all political parties, the mantra of economic growth remains probably as powerful now as it was before. And I think in that context, and I think this, personally, the way that I've reacted to that is you have to find a different language, you have to find a different story. And that's kind of what you're doing for me in regenerative economics. You're saying, forget growth, degrowth, forget the fight about ideology, forget whether you're going to come to terms with the GDP as a flawed measure, which we knew since Robert Kennedy back in 1968, and focus on something that you can
Different
create.
Robert Kennedy.
Yeah, the father of, right?
Gosh.
Well, yeah, but that's another conversation. Maybe we'll get to that later. But RFK Jr. certainly has an image problem. But
But
RFK
ironically,
Senior,
the junior would actually understand this conversation.
yeah,
Ironically.
he would, and to his credit, he would. But RFK Senior sort of said, this GDP, it measures everything in life except that which makes life worthwhile. He had it nailed in 1968. And so, that makes me, kind of gives me, I remember when I first heard, they'd unearthed a tape of him talking at this University of Kansas meeting at the beginning of his ill-fated presidential campaign in March 1968. And it was like listening to wisdom coming down from history, supporting the things that we were still trying to work on. 1968 was before limits to growth. So the ideas come around, they keep coming around. And in a sense, our ability to tell a new story, an exciting story, a different story, that's exactly, to me, why an idea like regenerative economics does break you out of that narrow impasse you were talking about.
Yeah, and it's, this has happened before in history. It was 1,000 years that the scientists were trying to explain the wobbles, meaning the reason the planets would reverse course and then keep going around the Earth, until Copernicus suggested that the Earth is not the center of the universe. And then it was another 90 years before Galileo proved it. So we humanity have seen the dissonance of trying to unseat a paradigm. Hopefully, the machine paradigm of an economy versus a living organism paradigm won't take us 1,000 years to uncork. But again, it's fascinating intellectually and terrifying in reality that we essentially we listen to the wrong people. We choose our heroes and we listen to the wrong people, and that goes back to William Blake, who understood the limits of Newton's reductionist thinking. So with that, Louise,
Oh dear.
so Tim has struggled in, I'll call it the academy for lack of a better term, to bring radical thinking into the field and taken lots of personal risks. And one thing I think we all owe a gratitude to Tim and to Herman Daly, who was never allowed to teach in an economics department. He should have won a Nobel Prize, and he was never allowed inside an economics department. True story. And you're trying to bring this into big corporations.
Yes, I'm failed as an economist.
So tell us a little bit about again, maybe high level. For the last 15 years, you and your firm have been struggling to bring sustainability into big corporations, particularly public corporations, and now trying to, I would argue, up the game to bring regenerative thinking into big public corporations. How's that going?
So I think well, first of all, thank you for being here. I feel a little bit intimidated because you've got two sort of intellectual giants here. No, I do.
Stop.
You know I do.
I'm just a banker.
Yeah, thank God you're not a banker now. No, so I guess Volans was set up specifically to look at systemic change through business in particular. That has then bled into finance. And we've tried lots of different ways. At the moment, I think we're at a really interesting point because about 3-4 years ago, we have had these conversations before, and regenerative was beginning to seep in. Regenerative being in service of life or creating the conditions for life to flourish, which still sounds very woo-woo to most people if you were to say that in a boardroom. So what we've tried to do is a few different things. So one is link it to show, really to show the big picture of why changing and transformation within an organization or within an industry is the way to success. So a lot of the time we will use sort of foresight and future trends to bring that in, but then we have to deal with the humans. I feel like you skirted around it a little bit in your intro talk.
Keep me honest.
Well, one thing is to say, okay, we're going to have a purpose. We're going to be regenerative. So we had one big European company, mainly state-owned, which again makes a difference because they're not in a public market. And they're like, oh, we want to be leaders of sustainability. What does that mean? But leaders in sustainability means, you can measure, you've had a couple of impacts here or there. But for them, they already had a tradition of being socially inclusive and feeling as social, being state-owned, they were being looked at like that, as well as their profit. So how do you build all those things in together? And it links, in fact, to Tim's new book. I'm going to make a plug for it, The Care Economy, because regeneration is about how do you build into your business that you care. And that happens through setting the right targets, yes, having the governance in place and so on, but it also means you have to change how you operate as a business. One of the regenerative principles is aligning inside and outside. And if you don't do that, it's going to fail. And that is where every organization is failing right now.
Yeah, maybe I'd pick up on that. A lot of times people think this regeneration thing is either about agriculture or it's about the products and services. And in my course, I always start with culture. It's about how so one of the principles is in right relationship, and what that means is in symbiotic win-win relationship, and that begins with at the level of the self. It begins with the parts inside our body have to be in right relationship, or we get sick and we die. A family needs to be in right relationship. A business organization needs to, a government organization needs to be in right relationship to be healthy. So the place to start is, how do we show up at work together? Do we show up as cogs in the machine with a job description and a performance measure and a incentive system? That's actually the way it works, because the metaphor is a machine. But what if we showed up as our unique self and your unique self, and somehow they mix together the way the unique essence in living systems work together, and they manifest potential that no one knew about.
And we haven't set up our organizations like that at all, right? And that's why people who have woken up to the situation now are feeling a little bit like hostages in a system they can see is not working. We're going through the motions. Probably lots of people here in brilliant jobs who've joined an organization to do good. We're doing the stuff, and we can see that the organization isn't working, the system isn't working, which is why we need some of the frameworks that you and Tim are putting forward.
And just one quick addition on that. So another thing the regenerative paradigm is not is an ethical position. It's not a moral thing. Yes, it's a moral thing not to destroy the planet, but I'm trying to look at this purely through how reality works according to our best understanding. So, for example, inclusive economy is now a popular phrase, which is a moral imperative. I agree with it. But in living systems, one of the principles that I discerned is, in my language, I call it empowered participation. And that's not my desire, that's not my morals, that's actually how they work. And what that means, for example, is that my feet are empowered to participate in the circulation of oxygen in my body, which is really wonderful for my poor little feet down there that otherwise wouldn't get any oxygen. So it's a moral nice thing, but actually it's essential for my holistic health, because if my feet don't get oxygen, I can't walk. If I can't walk, I can't manifest the same potential I can if I can walk, or I'll have to manifest different potential. So again, it's not a let's be nice together thing. It's a system designed imperative. And if any one of these principles is not present, or patterns is not present, the weakest link brings down the whole system. So bringing this to our current conundrum in the world, if we were wise, we would actually understand that if half of the planet is struggling to find a meal today for their children, it's terrible for them. That's a moral issue, but it's actually undermining the health of the whole. And of course, now we're seeing that. It's not any longer theoretical. And you can go through each of these principles and more. It's not like these 8 are the truth. These are just one man's best effort to reduce, using reductionism for a moment. So it's not that reductionism is bad. It's just we can't allow the reductionism to determine what we believe is truth. If we look at each of them and then compare them to how we run our businesses, how we run a regional economy, a national economy, the global economy, how we manage investments, the relationship between investment capital and enterprise is probably one of the most extractive ones there is. 2 and 20 is just, it's nice if you can get it, but it's pure extraction. It triggers all kinds of unintended consequences. investing for maximizing IRRs to maximize 2 and 20 triggers all kinds of unintended consequences. I'm saying that as someone who did that for a living. I'm not saying that as you're bad people, you're greedy people. But if we understood that the consequences on the system affect us as well, we would understand why we have a poly crisis at this moment. And even things like globalization, which was promoted by both the liberal and the conservative politicians, misunderstood that efficiency is great for a machine, but it turns out in living systems, empirically true, efficiency is balanced with resiliency. And guess what? It's skewed toward resiliency, not efficiency. And guess what? The more volatile the context becomes, the more it skews toward resiliency. And so if you want to understand why the financial crisis happened, or why the global trade, the trade links, struggling for words, the global supply chains broke down in the pandemic, and why Germany was extremely upset with the supply line of natural gas. All of those were designed to increase efficiency. Those decisions that led to that were about optimizing efficiency and neglecting resiliency. So if we're going to have an economy that is regenerative, it needs to balance efficiency with resiliency as a core design principle, which goes directly against the Newtonian logic of neoclassical economics.
Okay, Tim, I was just going to say in 15 minutes, we'll be opening up to the audience for questions. So if you have burning questions, which I'm sure many of you do, we'll have 15, 20 minutes at the end for that. So just...
Yeah, so many things to say, really. I mean, first of all, there's quite a lot of overlap in the way that we think, which I hadn't known until coming back to you this evening after however many years it was since we last saw each other. But one of the most interesting things is this idea that the economy has departed from the way in which natural systems work. And when I was writing The Care Economy, thanks for the plug, Louise, which has a lot of resonance with the regenerative economy, one of the things that absolutely fascinated me was thinking about what health is and what care is. And like you, I wanted to avoid a kind of moralistic framing of care and frame it rather as a kind of dynamic principle. And the way that I think about it is that care is the restorative force that brings us back into balance, the balance that constitutes health. And as you mentioned, our bodies do that constantly, constant oversight of every aspect of our physical body, from breathing rate to heart rate to blood glucose to dopamine, as it turns out, all regulated within certain kinds of limits in a system that we're not even conscious of. It just happens automatically. And actually, you could go out from that. You could go into inorganic life. And I remember when I was writing the book, I had this weird moment when I was sitting on a beach with all this stuff going around my head, looking at the moon rising over the ocean. And this question popped into my head: does the moon care? And at first I thought, well, you've been just working too hard, Tim. Get over yourself. And then I kind of saw, well, if the moon does care, then in what sense can it be said to care? Well, first of all, it's constant. It's constantly at attention. Second of all, it brings things back into balance. It brings the tides back into balance constantly with regular predictability around. Not that they're not dynamic. They're never static. They're moving all the time, but they're constantly coming into this dynamic balance as you talk about it. And actually, without that dynamic balance, I began to realize we wouldn't even be here, because that tidal interstitial range, it's called, is where we crawled out of our ancestors crawled out of the ocean and began life as a species walking on the planet. And that, to me, did seem a sort of legitimate way of thinking about care as a dynamic principle. And then I read a book called The Wisdom of the Body, where actually is a book by a guy called Walter Cannon. It was written in 1932. And Walter Cannon was basically the father of this idea, which later became known as homeostasis, which sounds very kind of static, but expresses this idea of a kind of dynamic balance in physiology. And at the end of that book, which is all about physiology, he has an epilogue. And in the epilogue, he says, maybe if this is the way that bodies work, maybe there might be some principles here that we could
Really?
apply to the economy. And
Really?
yeah, no, it's crazy. And then he begins to think about what those principles might be. And so, I see in that sense, my
There's
endeavor
two of
and
us.
your endeavor, exactly, as being a part of a chain of people kind of thinking, actually, it isn't just all reductive, definitive science in which we proceed from A to B in a linear pathway and everything will be okay because it's getting bigger and bigger. Actually, that this chain of thought has a history. It has a pedagogy, it has a legacy in our thinking. And when you trace it back, of course, you can get way back. You can go to Aristotle or Hippocrates. You can find that idea that actually nature has a healing force of its own. And these are powerful ideas to interrogate what's become an orthodoxy. And I think, that's where I feel the power of this metaphor of a regenerative economy. It operates in spite of everything seeming against it in the existing system, and is absolutely vital for that same reason, because those ideas, keeping those ideas alive, irrespective of the crash, if it's going to happen, or this period of collapse and regeneration, when it comes to collapse, if it comes to collapse, those are the ideas we're going to want and need to start rebuilding something that doesn't fall into the same traps.
I was just going to say, which is why it's really important that it doesn't become politicized as ESG, sustainability, even the growth, post-growth. And yeah, I'm quite interested in me, I'm like, how we do this? This is all great, but how do we take that?
That's why we brought you here, the practical person.
There we go. Because at the moment, and we talked about it a lot, companies are moving from, we need to be responsible, to the resilience, and at least that's my pathway. And actually, you can only be resilient if you are regenerative, if you look at the system, if you wedge yourself there. And yet, we don't have the tools within companies, within finance, to invest in the right way, to make decisions in the right way. So we're still relying on the grassroots of human beings who are trying to do a good job and shaking it out.
Maybe I'll jump in on at this point to talk a little bit about the finance algorithm.
Please.
And the metaphor that I'm increasingly fond of, not as just a metaphor, but as an actual description of, I think, what's happening, which is the metaphor of a metamorphosis. And in a sense, we've been trying to make the caterpillar a little less fat and a little less greedy and to share more. But what if we're not trying to make the caterpillar a better caterpillar? But what if we're in the process of truly emerging into something none of us can see? A butterfly. Well, if you're into living systems, that's kind of a cool thing to explore. Well, how does that work? Well, it turns out one of the first things to go in the caterpillar is the immune system. Because what an immune system does is it keeps the organism in its current form. We think of it as what keeps us healthy, which it does if we're healthy, but it also keeps us in our current form. And so what is it that in our human economy that keeps the system in its current form? The finance algorithm, which is based in, we could have a whole conversation about, risk. The whole risk paradigm is based on what we call risk in finance. It's backward-looking data of the volatility of securities prices or foreign exchange prices, which has little to do with real risk in the real world that is changing radically as we sit here and speak. But that's the statistical paradigm of risk in financial markets. And that's the basis upon which we do all of our investment, I should say, not all of our, the leading hedge funds. Warren Buffett doesn't use modern portfolio theory, I promise. So it's not like everyone is ignorant, but this is the paradigm within which modern finance works. So getting back to the metamorphosis, if it's true that the immune system needs to disintegrate in order for a new immune system suitable to the new form, the butterfly, needs to emerge. We've seen evidence of us trying to do that, right? ESG, impact investing, these are early waves of trying to degrade the immune system. And so far, they haven't worked. But I believe the critical challenge, and I don't know how to do this, but the critical challenge is for us to rethink this finance algorithm. And that gets to well, there's a lot of things that need to be rethought, but one of the things that's different about the way financial capital moves versus a living system is that it accumulates. In living systems, there's a carbon cycle, there's a nutrient cycle, there's a water cycle. And if the economy is to think and behave like a living organism, it seems to me there has to be a capital cycle. And yet our capital system is designed to accumulate at the expense of natural and, to use simplified language, at the expense of natural and social capital. So we have, three things out of balance. And just to put in perspective how big this imbalance is, the US is the most philanthropic nation in the world, 2.2% of GDP, which ain't much. If you were to simply stabilize the balance of financial capital and other forms of capital, just to use that language, given a 6% return assumption, I worked out that philanthropy in the United States, or not even, let's not even call it philanthropy, let's just call it recycling capital, the capital cycle, would need to increase by 18x just to stabilize it, much less restore other forms of capital. And in European countries, it would be 3 times that because the accumulation function here is the design of what we do. So we have a massive redesign project ahead of us. Period.
Before we go to the audience for burning questions, love to invite, Dizit, if you have a final reflection before we.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I found absolutely and maybe it goes to your point about an immune system, and I'm still trying to get my head around your analogy or metaphor or whatever it is. Is it analogy or metaphor? I don't know. But I like it. And one of the reasons why I like it is that one of the unusual, the unexpected, the unusual suspects who accosted me after Prosperity Without Grace was published was people from the financial sector. And I was going like, why are these guys interested in this? Because isn't growth the sort of mantra par excellence of the entire financial architecture? And one of the things that I found, and I mean, you were in some ways an example of this, that the finance industry is full of incredibly bright people. And a lot of them are actually quite committed to the idea of doing good. They're not in an industry trying to be bad guys. They're not.
Some are.
Maybe some are. But I think even
100%,
those guys actually think that they're the good guys. Nobody wants to think they're the bad guys. So, but at least the people that I met, which were part of that cohort of different attempts, sustainable finance, responsible finance, ethical finance, finance for good, profit with a purpose, they were trying to shift something inside
100%.
the system. And they were hungry for ways of doing that. And yet, as you say, that hasn't as yet shifted the core architecture, which is why the butterfly metaphor, is that an analogy or a metaphor? It's a metaphor. That butterfly metaphor is nice because nobody expects the butterfly. You see a caterpillar getting slower and slower and eventually winding up in a ball of fluff that looks like it's decaying from the inside out, which is quite a good metaphor for the financial system. And then out of that comes the butterfly, which nobody expected. I really like that as an idea. And I think I don't know that we're necessarily seeing that yet as an idea, but one of the things it reminds me of is this idea of disease. So in health, for example, the disease is part of the cure. I remember when I first came across that idea, it was written in a pamphlet written by Florence Nightingale in 1859 called Notes on Nursing. And the first sentence is, can we just take it as read that disease, as we see it, is more or less a part of a restorative process? In other words, it's part of getting back to health. And it actually opens up a whole set of ideas that all the things we'd like to denigrate, all the things we'd like to piss on, for use of a scatological phrase, all the things we hate about capitalism are actually, in some sense, not only part of a disease, but a part of the disease that it's bringing us back towards health. So what is that disease, and what is it trying to prompt us to do? What is that restorative process that even capitalism, even the heart of capitalism in the financial industry, is trying to bring us back towards, and is in the process of doing so, and is full of lots of good people who would become a part of the butterfly if only they knew how to rise from the disease and become the health of the organism. I don't know if I'm asking for a response or just ranting
No,
somewhat.
it's
I
good.
don't know.
I'll just throw in another word, which is disturbance. In my work on the grasslands, we talk about disturbance being, if you have a decayed, degrade landscape, say it's been overgrazed and desertifying, um, logic says get the animals off, let it recover. Turns out, what you actually do is move massive amounts of animals in and disturb it, and then move them off and let. So you're turning over the soil, you're fertilizing it, you're putting moisture down, bugs down that is in the urine, all kinds of things. And then you move the animals away, which is how it works in natural systems. If you go to Africa, you'll see that happening. They move away because of predators, not because of management, but that's what holistic management is in the context of the grasslands. Holistic management in the context of health is just what you described. And so this is not an idea limited to economics. It's education, health, governance. It's the whole shebang.
And good. I'm so glad you stopped short of reminding us that your president of the US is a great disturbance for us all. Thank you. I was
Honestly,
literally waiting
no,
for
no.
it. No, but we've discussed this before. There is that disturbance, and maybe we
You're
are
looking for a silver
in the
lining.
well, always. This is what I do, right? I want to pick up actually a little bit of what Tim said, if I can.
Yeah.
So one of the things I really like about the book is that you're giving us different lenses. So it doesn't matter where you work, you're giving us a lens of what might change. And what you were saying, I guess, is we know that there are many, many, many brilliant people with the right heart. And they're all like, oh, we don't know what to do, because we keep talking about it as systemic change and systems change and new design. And that's all right. But I think what you open up for me is, and actually, that's also in the behavior that we each display every day when we are not at work, when we're walking down the street, and whether we nod at somebody or smile or shout.
Say what they said to you.
Yeah, I got shouted at today by a cyclist. But that there's something about how we behave that will allow us to come back to that health. And that's something each of us actually could just practice in the very small bit every day. And I know we've got to go to questions now, so shut up, Katie. I see it.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
as little as
Yeah.
the small acts of kindness
Yeah, all
actually
of that.
begins to shift.
And we have to shift, because actually that is the basis of the problem with this system, is that we are assuming that we are economic, selfish, don't like each other, and so on. Not that we are connected, loving, and could have a lot of fun if we allowed ourselves to.
Right. In our course, we have a framing I, we, and it. And we first try to apply these ideas to literally our own selves, our own bodies, because that's easier to see. And then it gets a little harder when you get to an organization, and then it gets much harder when you get to the abstraction of a global economy. But if living systems are fractal, which they are, the logic is that the same patterns and principles apply. In each different context, it's going to look very different. One of my favorite sayings is every snowflake is unique, but every snowflake looks like a snowflake. So this regenerative economy is not going to look like one thing, but it's going to look like one thing. And the common thing to quote scale, to use our old language that we need to loosen up on, is what scales are the patterns and principles. Not because, they don't scale because they scale from a mechanistic point of view. They scale because they are as definition of reality. So we can count on them as our compass, if you will.
Thank you, Louise, for bringing it down to the scale of us as well as individuals, because I'm hoping that all of us will step away from tonight and figure out how we're going to be participating in the evolution of the regenerative economy. Whoa, I knew that was going to happen. Sure, yeah, you were definitely first. Just
Me, yes. Hi. Thank you for your wonderful ideas. I just wanted to ask if you think that ecological economics and regenerative economics are incompatible with capitalism, and maybe just another word for socialist economics. And also, I wanted to ask Tim if he was banned from the economics department because maybe he had some Marxist ideas.
I was just wondering if we just take 2 questions now and then another 2. So hold on to your answers for that. Sure, yeah. Pass the gentleman in the 3rd row. Yep, with your jacket, green jacket.
Yep. No, I thank you very much for your thoughts. Absolutely aligned with the principles of what you're saying. I did have one concern though, and that was with regard to the idea of collapse and then being able to recover from a collapse. And the problem with the collapse, it can be absolutely irrecoverable from. And the reason why I asked that, and maybe I picked up the wrong idea, I recently read Naomi Klein's excellent book. Just had a mental blank. It is. No, it's sorry, I wrote it down. No, it's the shock doctrine. The shock doctrine, which absolutely underlines the thesis of the sort of economics and principles, which then destroys this, as it were, raised earth policy. You destroy it from an economic perspective and then regenerate it. So my view is that to start to talk of collapse as something which incites change is perhaps an approach which should be steered away from. We absolutely need to stop thinking about collapse and stop it in its tracks with regard, using indeed all the correct, and I look forward to reading your book, strategies and approaches and, the principles which you're underlining.
So maybe I'll start there since my brain is there, and then I'll come back. So I think, we have to acknowledge the base case is not pretty. This is how could it possibly turn out good, not the base case of how to make it good. I don't mean to be a doomer and gloomer, but I think, having considered all the facts, one needs to be pretty sanguine. Having said that, I don't believe there's any chance that we happen to live in at the moment in the 14 billion year history of the universe that it's all going to come to an end. And so it's not a question of will there be collapse, won't there be collapse? Depending on where you live, there is collapse today, yesterday. And life will the adaptive cycle, life will reorganize after a collapse. It doesn't mean it'll continue to a higher level of complexity in our lifetime. We may collapse down to a much more simple level of complexity for a very long time. I mean, a new dark age is not off the realm of possibilities. But if life does what life has done for 18 billion years, we will reorganize, in my opinion, most likely with humans as well, but some people don't think so. And so whatever happens, aligning with how life works seems to me the self-evident objective that we need to finally learn. I don't know if that answers your point. And on the socialism, Marxism, I can't answer whether Tim was excluded from the department. But,
yeah, we want to hear that.
But I actually think this has nothing to do with political ideology. This sits above political ideology. And because it sounds green, it gets associated with certain political ideologies. But my hope is that actually we will become wiser as humans to recognize that we're a part of nature, not apart from nature, and we'll participate in the process of nature. And there will be isms on the left and isms on the right that will be fighting for how best to do that, as opposed to what we have today, which is not a healthy situation. So to me, well, I'll leave it at that.
Can I make a really small comment that might combine the two? As far as I can see, we are at a time where, because we're close to collapse or in collapse, where actually pragmatism and these principles of regeneration and nature and living systems are going to coalesce. And we're just beginning to see it. So instead of having to say, oh, this is left or right, actually, this is the sensible thing. And as long as we don't go in evangelizing, we can make a case for all of these things, that this is the right, sensible thing, no matter how you are thinking, because we are where we are, unfortunately.
Yeah, I find that question quite a tough one, actually. Let me just head off. Am I a Marxist? I'm going to not declare on that. But it wasn't that got me out of the economics department. In fact, I worked very closely with the economics department until Prosperity Without Growth was published. And after Prosperity Without Growth was published, I had difficulty even persuading them to take money that we'd won on grants to fund work, because of its association with the idea of a critique on growth. It's that easy. Does ecological economics mean, is it compatible with capitalism? I mean, I personally think that capitalism has some innate features which do make it very difficult to think of them as consistent with each other. But that's, I think you have to delve a little bit deeper as to why, to answer that question. The question about, do we seek collapse because out of that might come renewal, I do find that slightly problematic. And of course I find it problematic because it would be associated with massive suffering. And that suffering is already happening around the world. And that's something we should recognize. And so I think what I take there is a position of, whether it's going to collapse or not going to collapse, what we need to hold on to is principles that will help us in either way, in either situation. The worst happens, then we've still got those principles. We're still holding on to the idea of care, of regeneration, with the sanctity of life, of the progression of the human spirit, whatever that might mean. We still have connection and meaning and purpose as being fundamental aspects of human society. And we also seek some kinds of things which stabilize rather than destabilize. And that's where I see care coming in. Care is a stabilizing force. The opposite of it, actually, and sociologists are quite sort of insightful about this, the opposite of care is violence. And you can't understand care without understanding violence. And care is stabilizing, violence is destabilizing. And so that the idea that you seek destabilizing things can possibly make sense when you're looking at a status quo that's not changing anything. But when you're in a system which is becoming unstable and leading towards violence, as we undoubtedly are at the moment, then our actions should be oriented towards stability and towards care. And it actually is a very practical thing, because it says to you immediately that the response to geopolitical instability is not armament, rearmament, and war. It is diplomacy. It's a pragmatic conclusion from a point of principle about an understanding of the system that says instability sucks in the short term, and possibly not in the long term, but in the short term, and it has immense human consequences. And so I tend towards the idea that we should appreciate that collapse is happening, but that we should engage in principles that aim for some sense of long-term stability.
Yeah, let me just also clarify, I 100% agree. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that we all feel somewhat helpless to control that. And so not to give up, because even if things happen that we hate happening and we can't stop happening, that doesn't mean that, a good outcome can't come out of that. But I 100% agree we should do whatever we can to mitigate the violence in particular. And just a quick comment, going back to the capitalism question, I'm increasingly thinking that at the core, if we had a institution of the commons, and there's a chapter in the book on this. This is a whole big conversation. But if we had an institution of the commons, like the institution of the private sector, on the scale of that, that managed all of the commons, in an ideal world, literally all of the natural commons and all of the technological, cultural commons, then the system, the free enterprise system, which is what I prefer to call it, would be contained within bounds that kept it from destroying the bigger system. And also, you'd have to pay rent to use the commons, which would become a massive source of abundance for all of us. So there's a lot to say on it, but I think we can't just throw capitalism out, full tilt, because there are, the entrepreneurial spirit is profoundly regenerative and profoundly important for our thriving. And so it's really a question of controlling the system within, in a sense, putting guardrails around the system so we can't hurt ourselves.
We're going to go, two more questions, and then we are going to be out of time. So, but the gentleman here, and then the lady in the red here, and then it's up to Lily.
Hi, everybody. This is David Bent, atelier of What's Next. Hi to everybody on the stage. On collapse, I recommend there's a 4-part episodes from Past, Present, Future, which explores Goliath's curse, which explores the last 10,000 years of collapse and its future. So everyone should listen to that, and they'll understand more about what we're saying. My question is the question I ask at every book launch, even Tim's as well. What are the good faith arguments against what you're proposing?
That's easy. It's not practical.
Thank you. Good evening. Thanks for a very thought-provoking session. I'm going to go with Louise on the practical side, talking to businesses and corporates all the time. How do you see the role of insurance and what it can do today to actually leverage those financial flows that can actually deliver on that those regenerative systems that we're talking about? Because I think there's a lot to be done there, and there's a lot of technology that can help us through that. And we have an opportunity to stop thinking of risk in particular as a historical, and actually leverage technology with that progressive geospatial, et cetera, more practical and physical element. So just your thoughts on that.
Can we start? Well,
Thank you.
I think you almost answered your own question, because you're absolutely right. Insurance is incredibly important, and in fact, Julie's here is doing the planetary solvency project. Those kinds of projects are incredibly important to highlight this, but also to drive, whilst we are in a capitalist system, to drive pricing where it needs to be, and to start pricing in some of the crises we're seeing. And technology, especially predictive, is becoming better. I had a conversation with a climate scientist, and she said, unfortunately, it's not predictable at any stage, but absolutely, I couldn't agree more that it's very important. You've got more.
No, the only thing I'd add is that just to emphasize your last point, that insurance companies, as I'm sure you know, are pulling out of markets, not because they don't want to be in business, because we do not know how to price phase shifts transitions. We don't. We didn't used to, but we pretended. Yeah. That was the financial crisis. That was long-term capital. And now we're recognizing that we literally don't know how to predict in complex interconnected systems. And that.
That's where the actuary work is super interesting, right? And we need more of that. So, yeah.
But some scientists say you will never know how to price that.
Yeah.
Can I just ask the second part of David's question, which he usually asks but didn't ask? So what is the best good faith argument against what you're suggesting? And David?
So, this is a vision. There's no implementation plan
yet.
We need the practical people. You could say it's not practical. Fine. Is what we're doing practical? That's my response to it. If someone has a better idea, I'm 100% all in on it. This is going to sound, let's just say, overconfident, but I've been thinking about this problem for a quarter of a century, and I've been trying to find a better answer for a quarter of a century, and this is the best I got. And please tell me what's wrong about it. But first, make the case that the human economy is not a living organism, and then we'll throw the whole thing out and start over again. That help?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just thinking, the guy that gave us Newtonian physics got hit by an apple standing under a tree. How practical is that? But it was pretty influential, so.
We have been gifted just two final questions, a little bit over time. Lily's got this side.
Oh, hello.
Good.
Hello, my name is Phoebe. I am doing a master's in development studies. So my question is around developing countries and whether, I would agree they're all actually in crisis right now already, and maybe some of the solutions can come out of that crisis. So do you see a possibility of developing countries leading the charge in this maybe reform? And on a broader level, do you see it that like countries could be leading or specific states could be leading as opposed to a global movement of change?
We had a gentleman in the black and lady in the green, if they might go super fast and do them together, and then we synthesize our answers.
She's cheating.
Okay, really quick. I love the idea of systems and homeostasis, but I'd argue that the human's system is the worst example of homeostasis because we've developed an ego brain that sabotages the biological brain, and then it projects it onto society, hence why society is so imbalanced. So I just put that out there as just a comment on that.
Pass it to the lady in the green, thanks.
And I do actually have a question. Can you say more about the kind of resiliency that you mentioned? Because you talked quite a bit about it as an offset against efficiency.
Okay, so the human species is quite young, so we're adolescents. Give us a chance. Maybe we'll mature. And I actually mean that seriously. I do think we behave as an immature adolescence. Ian McGilchrist's book, Master and the Emissary, is critical reading on how our brains are designed to work and how we allow only half of them to lead our culture, left brain, right brain kind of stuff. On the development point, actually we did stories on projects that we saw the regenerative economy evidenced in years ago, and all of them were stressed situations. So yes, I think actually the last place the regenerative economy is going to start is, in the city of London. And it's much more likely to emerge in response to pressure, which is how systems change. So how we facilitate that is key. And, one of the problems with the development paradigm that you're being taught right now is we've chosen the instrument of debt. And it's not only debt, it's hard currency debt. That makes no sense. How many venture capitalists start a company with debt and succeed? So again, that gets back to the capital cycle. There's, the country we're sitting in right now, the startup capital was literally stealing the value add of the British textile industry, which at the time was 25% of global GDP. Think about that as a startup capital for development. So we need to figure out how to flow investment capital into developed world without strings attached, without criteria, without debt payments, and help them self-organize, which they probably know how to do already. They just need the wrench of the finance algorithm taken off their back. And then the resiliency thing, so there's a whole science of resiliency, and I'm not an expert at it, but there's also, are you guys familiar with the book Anti-Fragility by Taleb? So there's a whole way to think about resiliency that is different than our mechanistic thinking. And I don't want to at the end of the night here get into ergodicity, but there is genius in managing ecosystems of enterprises as a single whole, as opposed to managing single businesses and trying to have them become resilient. And the large scale example of this I always like to point to is the Mondragon cooperatives, which is now 20 billion euros of annual sales, 80 different companies, but they manage it as a single ecosystem. They pool profits across the ecosystem, which essentially mitigates the downside. So ergodicity is about path dependency. Something bad happens to company B, but company C has surplus that it can actually reinforce company B. They've managed this over 80 years now. And yes, some of these businesses go bankrupt, but they've managed it in such a way that no one's had to lose their job. They move the people around the ecosystem. When they start a new business, they start it within the ecosystem, which dramatically mitigates the risk. And they've created an anti-fragile ecosystem, which is just like a forest or a coral reef. So I think the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque Country in Spain, and everyone looks at that and says, oh, co-ops are the answer. No, it's not about co-ops, although that's an interesting design feature. It's about managing the whole holistically. It's about holism as opposed to reductionism. So we could spend a lot of time on it, but that's I think a point us in the right direction.
Very quickly on the point about other countries, I definitely think that idea that the charge could be led from elsewhere has a lot of resonance for me. One of the things that really surprised me when Prosperity Without Growth first published, that there were people coming from indigenous communities saying, look, actually, Tim, you're just rediscovering some stuff that we've known for quite a long time here. Well done. You're doing it inside the cradle of the beast and the heart of capitalism.
I've had that comment.
But so definitely some ideas about that. This question here from the clever guy in the middle, who usually should be sitting a little bit further back. Don't you love the cynics sitting in the back? Who, sorry, I'm miscaricaturing you, but only because I love that kind of intervention. And I think I could talk for about probably 2.5 hours about it. There's a lot. So your question, which I think is absolutely spot on, is isn't the homeostatic process that governs human behavior exactly where capitalism has come from? And I think there's so many answers to that question, but each of the answers forces us to think carefully and strategically about the relationship between the things that can be changed and the things that can't be changed. So as a sociologist, for example, you would argue, yes, human behavior matters inside the social system, but actually the social system matters to human behavior. There's a kind of symbiotic social system as it exists appears something solid. It doesn't appear as the outcome of our ideas. It appears as something unchangeable, like a culture that can't be changed. And actually, we behave inside that system in ways which are constrained in terms of our potential behaviors as organic beings. And the physiological answer actually reflects that same idea. There's a wonderful book called The Mirage of Health by René Dubos, published in 1959. And in it, he makes this incredibly interesting point, which is that is the challenge of an organism. Health never stays still. As you try to adapt, the process of health, according to that physiological view, is that you try to continually adapt the internal conditions in the face of changes in external circumstances. And the more successful you are at doing it, the greater the vitality that you have to go out into the world and change the world. But guess what? That changing the world changes the external conditions that you then have to now respond to. And that, I think, is the spirit in which your question is a really incredibly interesting and probing one, but it's the beginning of a sense of what our relationship is to the society we live in, rather than an end to the idea that as an individual species, we've created a system that is damning us all to hell. I'm not suggesting that was the entire thrust of your question, but
Maybe if we didn't treat our children as little machines to put them in a box to optimize them, they wouldn't come out so damaged.
I think we should call it. I think that was a really good ending, actually.
It was a great ending.
You
John
know,
wants to
Tim, I
help?
mean, in its summary,
No.
you're asking, what does it mean to be human at this moment, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a constant question. I think it's part of that attempt to achieve balance. Now that we've done it inside a system that is beginning to make us ill, inside an economic system that actually profits from disease and undermines our own neuropsychology to make us willing victims of that process, then if we're not asking the question, what does it mean to be human, then we are probably a failed species. And our ability to do that is the evidence that we're not.
Oh, beautifully said. I just want to say, can I say one little thing?
Yeah,
Which is,
please do.
because that was beautifully said and I don't want to ruin it, but we're still all about thought and mind. And I just want to talk about, we also have to feel what we feel. And not, yeah, we do. We
no.
do. I'm afraid. And this is where, as the discussion you and I had earlier, this is where that's another paradigm shift. We have to go from sitting in our minds, trying to think our way out of this problem, and also just tap into what we actually know is true.
Tim, Louise, thank you so much for coming and taking on this challenge of being in conversation with John. And John, thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.
And yeah, I studied under John in his first cohort of his course, and it's definitely just provided so much articulation, framework, and I guess just a sense of something that's really possible to put into action, to feel, to be, to think with, to do with, that was intuitive, but I just couldn't communicate it. And I have a lifetime of learning to get anywhere near to being able to, lead these conversations. But I just want to finish, if I may, with one of the little excerpts and a quote from Dana Meadows in your book.
Before you do that, can I just remind or let people know, if you're interested to dig into this, we just so happen to have a course beginning next week.
Sign up quickly.
Go to capitalinstitute.org. It's an 8-week course, 2 days a week. It's intense. It's end of the day, Europe time. But you'll join a community of 2,500 people from 80 countries who are wrestling to figure out how to put this into practice in the real world. And it's life-changing for people, not because of me, but because of the community that is engaged in this work.
Thanks. So this quote from Dana here says, "Your paradigm is so intrinsic to your mental process that you're hardly aware of its existence until you try to communicate with someone with a different paradigm." And so I want to leave that with all of you. I invite anyone who hasn't read it or got a copy to read the book, and then to think about how you might start to communicate the paradigm that you're seeing, and taking the insights from these amazing panelists. So thank you, everybody. John's going to be signing books here now in the corner.